Chapter 6. The Lie Older Than Time. There is a sentence that has survived generations. It has crossed cultures, classes, continents, and centuries. It has been whispered in hotel corridors and spoken across restaurant tables and delivered in the specific, practiced cadence of someone who has rehearsed it long enough to believe it. It sounds, by the time it arrives, entirely reasonable, almost compassionate. The kind of thing someone says when they have thought carefully about the situation and arrived at a conclusion that is both honest and, perhaps, overdue. The sentences vary. They are repackaged across time with different words, different tones, different levels of detail. But they are the same sentence. They have always been the same sentence. It's over between us. I'm just waiting for the right moment. We're separated, even if we haven't made it official yet. You're different from anyone I've ever known. I'm in the process of leaving. It's complicated, but I'm leaving. My marriage has been over for a long time. We're just going through the motions. The precise wording is less important than the function the sentence performs. It creates space. It converts a situation that would, under honest examination, require the person hearing it to make a difficult decision, to say, I will not be part of this, into a situation that feels provisional, transitional, almost morally neutral. It does not ask for a crossing of lines. It suggests that the lines have already moved. This chapter is about that sentence, about the specific psychology of how it works, why it persists across centuries and cultures, what it does to the person who hears it, and what it reveals about the person who says it, and about how the specific version of that sentence that was apparently spoken in the months before July 16th, 2025, at a Coldplay concert, contributed to a chain of events whose costs are still being carried by people who were never given the option of hearing it for themselves. The comfort of a convenient truth. The most effective lies are not outrageous. Outrageous lies are easily dismissed. They ask too much of the listener, require too radical a departure from observable reality, and trigger the resistance that most people bring to claims that feel implausible. The lies that do the most damage are the ones that are close enough to truth to feel believable, close enough to the actual complexity of a real situation to pass without friction. These lies do not ask you to suspend logic. They ask you to soften it, to lean into possibility, to give the benefit of the doubt in a situation where the doubt is precisely the point. We're separated is this kind of lie when it is not true, because it is the kind of claim that cannot be immediately verified. Separation is a process rather than a precise moment. Marriages contain long periods of difficulty and distance that are genuinely hard to categorize. The person making the claim can, if pressed, point to real things, real strain, real distance, real conversations about the future that went unresolved, and the person hearing the claim is usually in a state where they want to believe it. Not passively, actively, because the alternative, the clear-eyed recognition that the situation is not what it is being presented as, requires them to do something uncomfortable, to confront, to refuse, to walk away. This is what makes the convenient truth so durable across generations. It works not because it is convincing, exactly, but because it gives both parties something they need. The person saying it needs permission, and the person hearing it needs to feel that the permission being given is legitimate. The convenient truth manufactures that legitimacy out of ambiguity. Research on self-deception and infidelity documents this with uncomfortable precision. Clinical psychologist Kristen Snowden, who has spent years working with people on both sides of affairs, observes that the unfaithful person must continually tell themselves a story about the primary relationship in order to make their decision seem logical. Their emotional survival depends on the story. In many cases, the lies told to the affair partner are simply an externalization of the lies already being told internally. The affair partner hears the version the unfaithful person has come to believe, not because it is true, but because believing it is the only way to continue. The space between truth and timing. There is a distinction that the convenient truth exploits with surgical precision, the difference between something being true and something being true now. A relationship may be genuinely strained, the distance may be real, the conversations about separation may have happened. The unhappiness may be genuine, fully felt, and not fabricated. All of these things can be simultaneously true and coexist with the equally true fact that the relationship has not ended, that no formal decision has been made, that the spouse at home is living inside a version of the marriage that does not include any of this information, that the children are getting up in the morning in a household that is, as far as they know and as far as any legal or formal reality is concerned, intact. The word separated carries enormous freight in this context because it implies a mutual acknowledged state. In its honest form, it means that both people know they are no longer together, that the living arrangements or emotional commitments or both have been formally restructured, and that both parties are operating from the same map of what the relationship currently is. When the word is used to describe something that is felt unilaterally, or anticipated rather than actual, or discussed in principle but not implemented, it is doing something that accurate language does not do. It is presenting a wished-for future as a present fact. Kristen Cabot, in her March 2026 interview with Oprah Winfrey, said that a lot of what was represented to me was not true, a careful, non-specific way of saying that she was told something about the status of Andy Byron's marriage that turned out not to be accurate. She declined to specify exactly what she was told, but the pattern she was describing, the representation of a relationship as effectively over when it was not, is one of the oldest and most documented patterns in the research on how affairs begin and how they are sustained. The person who hears we're separated does not get access to the information that the spouse has. They cannot call the other household and ask. They cannot verify the claim against the reality it purports to describe. They can only weigh it against their own judgment, their own instincts, their own willingness to give or withhold the benefit of the doubt. And in that asymmetry of information, one person knowing the full picture, one person knowing only the version they have been given, the convenient truth does its work. Emotional affairs before physical ones. What is consistently misunderstood about infidelity by people who have not studied it closely, and even by people who are inside it, is that it almost never begins with the physical. The physical is usually the last crossing, not the first. By the time it occurs, a great deal has already happened. The boundaries have already been tested and found more flexible than they appeared. The emotional investment has already been made in a place where it was not supposed to be made. The story justifying what is happening has already been constructed and reinforced. The physical crossing is the completion of a process, not its initiation. It begins with attention, with the specific quality of being seen by someone in a way that feels different, more acute, more personal, more attuned to the particular version of yourself that exists in that context. It begins with conversation, with the discovery that there is a register of exchange available with this person that feels rare or urgent or simply more alive than what is available elsewhere. It begins with connection that is categorized initially as innocent, professional, collegial, the natural intimacy that develops between people who spend significant time together and who share challenges and pressures and moments of genuine difficulty. Research on how affairs begin documents this progression with consistency across cultures and contexts. As clinical therapist Kristen Snowden describes it, the unfaithful partner typically has unmet needs, not necessarily sexual, often emotional, sometimes simply the need to feel competent or valued or fully seen. And the person who meets those needs does so gradually, through accumulated small moments that each seem, individually, harmless. Time is redirected. Energy is invested where it was not previously invested. Thoughts begin to linger elsewhere, and the boundaries that once felt clear begin to feel negotiable, not because a decision was made to remove them, but because each small movement beyond them was justified in the moment as something other than what it was. This is the mechanism that psychology today describes as small seeds of dishonesty taking root. The affair is not built in a single act of betrayal. It is built in 100 small acts of self-deception that, individually, were explicable as something less significant than what they were accumulating into, and each justification makes the next one easier. Each small crossing makes the next one feel less like a crossing, until eventually what would have been clearly unacceptable at the beginning of the process has become, through the gradual erosion of standards, the current reality. The working environment accelerates this process in ways that are well documented. Proximity is itself a risk factor. Research from Amen clinics notes that closeness to coworkers, whether in person or virtual, is a recognized pathway to emotional and sexual affairs, particularly when the working relationship involves shared pressure, mutual reliance, and the specific kind of trust that develops when people face difficulties together. A CEO and his chief people officer, navigating the pressures of leading a billion-dollar company, traveling to the same conferences, sharing the same strategic anxieties. These are the conditions in which emotional intimacy develops without necessarily being chosen. The proximity does the work, the feelings follow. This does not excuse the choices that follow the feelings. Feelings are not choices. The actions taken in response to feelings are. The narrative that makes it acceptable. In that developing space, a narrative begins to form. It is not usually a conscious construction. Most people engaged in this process do not sit down and decide to build a justifying story. The story assembles itself from the available materials, the genuine unhappiness in the primary relationship, the genuine quality of the new connection, the genuine feeling that this is different from what it might look like to an outside observer who did not understand the full context. The narrative sounds, from the inside, like clarity. It sounds like a person finally being honest with themselves about what they actually need and what their primary relationship has failed to provide. It has the quality of self-knowledge. It positions the person as someone responding authentically to their real situation rather than someone crossing a line they agreed not to cross. From the outside, particularly from the perspective of the person in the primary relationship who has not been given access to any of this narrative, it sounds quite different. It sounds like someone constructing a story designed to allow themselves to do something they know they should not do while insulating themselves from the full weight of what they are doing. Both of these descriptions contain truth. The unhappiness may be real. The connection may be genuine. The feelings may be authentic in every sense the word authentic can carry. And simultaneously, the narrative may be doing exactly what the external observer suspects, converting a choice into a circumstance, an action into a response, a decision into something that simply happened. The research on what clinicians call the affair fog is instructive here. When a person is deep in an emotional or romantic entanglement that is still being sustained by the internal narrative, they are not operating from the same cognitive baseline as they would be outside of it. Neurologically, the early stages of intense romantic attachment produce changes in brain chemistry, elevated dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin that have been compared, not casually, but by researchers at institutions including the State University of New York, to the neurological state produced by cocaine. The brain in this state is not lying exactly, but it is operating in a mode that makes the story it is telling feel far more certain, far more morally clear, far more like truth than it actually is. When a spouse is in the affair fog, one clinical account describes, they operate from a highly emotional space, losing clarity. You could discuss their illogical decisions and their impact on others for hours, and it may not resonate. You are communicating with someone in an entirely different reality. This is not an excuse. It is a description of a neurological state that does not remove moral responsibility, but does explain why the person experiencing it is able to believe things about their primary relationship, about the new relationship, about the legitimacy of their choices, that look from any external perspective, like a story built to serve a specific purpose. Belief does not remove responsibility. This is the point at which a great deal of public conversation about infidelity takes a wrong turn. Having established that feelings can be genuine, that self-deception is a neurological as well as a moral phenomenon, that the narrative that develops is often believed sincerely by the person telling it, the conversation sometimes slides from explanation into exculpation. From "here is how this happens" to "here is why it is understandable" to "here is why the person who experienced it as a feeling rather than a choice carries less responsibility for it than we initially assumed." This is the wrong destination. Feeling something genuinely does not make it harmless. Believing a story sincerely does not make it true. Constructing a narrative from real materials, real unhappiness, real connection, real feelings, does not transform the consequences of the choices made within that narrative into something other than consequences. The person whose marriage was described as effectively over to someone else is still living inside a marriage they believe to be intact. The children whose family structure is being renegotiated by people who have not consulted them are still getting up in the morning in a household they understand to be whole. The impact of the choices does not wait for the narrative to be resolved before beginning. Research published in the Journal of Sex Research, examining motivations for extradyadic behavior across multiple studies, documents a consistent finding. People who cheat are significantly more likely than people who do not to blame external factors for their behavior and to attribute responsibility internally for their partner's equivalent behavior. In other words, the person who cheats and is later cheated on characteristically says of their own infidelity, "Circumstances brought me here, the relationship had problems, I felt things I could not control." And of their partners, "They chose to do this. It was deliberate. They are responsible." The asymmetry of attribution is not random. It is the specific, self-protective signature of a mind that is managing its own accountability by building a story that locates agency primarily in the circumstances rather than in the choices. This is not unique to infidelity. It is a feature of human moral psychology that operates across many domains, but it is particularly visible in the context of affairs because the convenient truth, the sentence that crosses cultures and centuries, is the specific form this asymmetric attribution takes when it is externalized. The feeling is presented as the explanation, the circumstance is presented as the cause, and the person who hears the sentence is asked to accept, along with its content, the moral framework that generated it. The role of the listener. But this chapter cannot be complete without turning its attention to the person who hears the sentence, because the convenient truth requires a listener as much as it requires a speaker, and the listener's role in what follows is more complicated than the story usually allows. There is a moment, often a specific, identifiable moment, in which something inside the listener registers the ambiguity, the uncertainty, the lack of finality in what they are being told, the recognition that the situation being described is still in progress, still unresolved, still involving people whose lives are being affected by decisions they are not yet aware of. In that moment, a choice is made, not necessarily consciously, not necessarily dramatically, but a choice is made between pressing further, asking the harder questions, requiring more clarity, being willing to say, "I need to know that this is actually what you say it is," and accepting what is being offered. Accepting what is being offered does not make the listener as responsible as the person who offered it. The asymmetry of information matters. The listener is working with what they have been given, and what they have been given has been carefully shaped by someone who knows more than they do. The lie told to the listener is a genuine injury, even when the listener wanted to believe it, even when the believing was partly chosen because the alternative was harder. But the research on what therapists describe as the other person in affairs, the person who was told the convenient truth and accepted it, does not find them entirely without agency. Relationship therapist Becky Lennox, who has worked extensively with people in this position, observes that the need to be chosen, to be the exception, to be the person worth the disruption, these needs are real and they actively shape the listener's response to ambiguity. People who get involved with partnered people, she writes, are usually desperate to feel special. They want to be the exception. They want to win. This wanting is not pathological. It is human, but it influences how critically the convenient truth is examined when it arrives. Cabot has said, with notable candor, that she was told things that turned out not to be true. She was, in her own account, deceived by the person who represented the situation to her. This deserves to be taken seriously. Deception by someone you trust is a genuine injury, and the responsibility for the deception belongs primarily to the person who constructed it, but the full picture also includes the knowledge available to Cabot in real time that she was the chief people officer of the company in which this relationship was developing, that her professional responsibility included the protection of the company's employees from exactly the kind of dynamic a relationship between a CEO and his direct report represents, that the disclosure plan, the plan to go to the board to restructure the reporting lines, was made 5 to 6 days before the concert, not at the beginning of the relationship. Whatever the state of the marriage she was told about, the professional dimensions of the situation were available to her independent of anything Byron represented. This is not a verdict. It is a description of the full picture, which is what this book has consistently argued the full picture deserves to be. Why the script persists. The lie older than time persists because it works, not because the people who use it are uniquely cynical or malicious. Some are, but most are not. It persists because it is the specific solution that the architecture of human desire in the specific circumstances of a developing emotional attachment finds most readily available. It converts a situation that would otherwise require a difficult choice, leave first, then pursue, into a situation that feels like a natural progression. It allows both parties to move into something they might otherwise refuse by reframing the crossing of lines as the arrival of a reality that was already true. Research across 160 cultures has confirmed that spousal infidelity is the single most common reason for the breakdown of committed relationships globally. This is not a Western phenomenon, not a modern one, not one produced by any particular set of social conditions. It is a cross-cultural constant, which means the convenient truth that enables it, the sentence that creates the space, the narrative that makes the crossing feel like progression rather than transgression, is equally cross-cultural. The specific words change, the function does not, and the function is always the same: to create enough distance from the full reality of the situation to allow the person within it to move forward without fully confronting what they are leaving behind. The spouse who does not know, the children who are not told, the relationship whose status is described in terms that its other occupant would not recognize. The convenient truth does not make any of those things disappear. It simply ensures that the person crossing the line does not have to look at them directly while the crossing is happening. The line that does not move. All of this, the neuroscience, the self-deception, the affair fog, the genuine feelings, the convenient truth, the role of the listener, is context. It is important context. It explains how this happens with enough frequency and consistency across enough cultures and centuries to count as a feature of human behavior rather than an aberration. Understanding it is not the same as excusing it, because beneath all of that context, something remains that is not changed by any of it. The person in the primary relationship, the spouse, the partner, the person whose life is structured around the assumption of fidelity, is still living inside that structure. The story being told to them about their own life is still, until they are told otherwise, the only story they have access to, and no amount of genuine feeling, sincere belief, neurological fog, or carefully constructed narrative changes what it means to someone to discover that the story was false. The discovery does not care about the context. It arrives as a fact. The marriage you believed you were in was not the marriage that existed. The person you trusted was constructing a parallel reality and managing your access to it. The decisions that are now being made about your life, about your household, your family, your future, have been made without your knowledge or consent by people who had reasons for keeping it that way. These are not abstract philosophical harms. They are the specific, documented, measurable harms that the research in Chapter 5 of this book examined in careful detail: the fracture in the shared story, the dissolution of trust, the identity disruption, the PTSD level symptom cluster, the impact on children who carry what they cannot name. The convenient truth does not prevent any of those harms. It only defers the moment at which they have to be acknowledged. The specific version of the lie. In the story this book has been examining, the convenient truth took a specific form. Kristen Cabot says she was told things that turned out not to be true. She said that what was represented to her was not accurate. She said that lying is a non-negotiable for her and that there was a significant miss on honesty and integrity. She chose her words carefully. She did not want to speak for another person's experience, she said. She did not want to do to someone else what had been done to her, which was to have the world speak on her behalf. This restraint is admirable. It is also consistent with the larger pattern this book has been documenting, the pattern in which the full account is offered with careful gaps, in which the most damaging implication is present but not stated, in which the listener is given enough to understand without being given everything they would need to verify. What the careful language implies is that Andy Byron told Cabot his marriage was effectively over, that he represented himself as a man in the same situation she was, both of them navigating the end of their marriages, both of them being honest about their situations, both of them in circumstances that were similar enough that what was developing between them was not the transgression it would have appeared to be to someone who did not know the full context. If this is accurate, and this book does not know what is accurate, only what has been said, then Megan Kerrigan Byron was lied to twice. Once in the ordinary, ongoing way that a spouse is lied to when their partner is sustaining a narrative about the marriage that is not the reality. And once in the specific way that a spouse is lied to when their partner describes the marriage to a third person as something the spouse would not recognize, as over or effectively over or in the process of ending, without the spouse knowing that this description is being offered. She was the last person to know the story her husband was telling about her life. She found out on a jumbotron, and the person who had been told the convenient truth has since built a speaking circuit around the experience of surviving the aftermath, while the person who was told nothing has maintained the silence that privacy, dignity, and the specific weight of being the unspoken name in someone else's account of events that most directly affected her require. And yet, we know. Despite all of it, the genuine feelings, the real circumstances, the neurological states that make self-deception possible and belief feel like clarity, there is something that does not require research to understand. Something that has always been understood in every culture across every century in which this sentence has been spoken. We know when something is not fully true, not always immediately, not always with the specific language to articulate what we are sensing, but something in us registers the gap between the story being offered and the reality it describes. The instinct that Chapter 3 of this book examined, the instinct we are taught to suppress in favor of the confidence of the person speaking, the smoothness of the delivery, the genuine emotion in the account. That instinct is not random. It is calibrated. It is the mind's way of telling us that the information we have been given and the information that exists are not the same set. The people who watched the Oprah interview and felt, quietly and persistently, that something was not fully present, they were using that same calibration. They could not, most of them, specify exactly what was missing, but they felt the frequency beneath the words, the gap between the told story and the lived one, the specific quality of a narrative that has been shaped to serve a purpose rather than to serve the truth. And they were not wrong to feel it. The line between what was said and what was true, between the convenient version and the actual one, between the story that was offered and the story that was lived, did not move because the feelings were genuine. It did not move because the circumstances were complicated. It did not move because the narrative was coherent and emotionally compelling and delivered on the most prominent media platform in the world. It remained clear, uncomplicated, unaffected by explanation, as it always has, in every century, in every culture, in every room where this sentence has been spoken and believed and acted upon, and eventually, inevitably, had its consequences arrive for the people who were never given the option of knowing it was being said.